From the 7 hills of ancient Italy to the far reaches of 3 continents, this is the story of Rome, the greatest empire the world has ever known. Over the next hour, we'll witness the rise of a civilization that would dominate the known world for over 1,000 years. From a small city-state to an empire stretching from Britain to the deserts of Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the rivers of Mesopotamia. Before we journey back through time, I want to connect with our global audience watching tonight, whether it's late evening in Los Angeles, the middle of the night in London, or early morning in Tokyo. Please take a moment to tell us in the comments what time it is where you are and which part of the world you're joining us from. There's something fitting about people from across the globe learning about an empire that once united much of the ancient world. If you enjoy this type of in-depth historical documentary content, especially designed for evening viewing, please consider subscribing to support our work. Your subscription helps us continue producing these comprehensive historical documentaries that you can learn from during the day or drift off to at night. Tonight's story spans nearly 1,200 years of human history. We'll explore how a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber River grew into a republic that conquered the Mediterranean. We'll witness the transformation into an empire that would define Western civilization. And we'll examine the complex factors that led to its eventual transformation and decline. This is more than just the story of battles and emperors. This is the story of innovation and engineering, of law and governance, of culture and language that still shapes our world today. This is the story of how Rome built roads that lasted centuries, aqueducts that supplied massive cities, and legal principles we still follow. So settle in as we travel back to 753 BC, to a time when the Mediterranean world was divided among dozens of tribes and city-states, when travel was dangerous and communication was slow, when most people lived and died within miles of where they were born. In this world, few could have imagined that one small Italian settlement would grow to rule them all. Our story begins beside the Tiber River, where legend and history intertwine in the founding of Rome. Part 1. The Beginning, 753-509 BC. Rome's birth, the legend of Romulus and Remus. In the hills of central Italy, where the Tiber River winds its way toward the sea, ancient people told a story that would echo through the centuries. It was the story of 2 baby brothers, abandoned to die, who would instead found the greatest city the world had ever seen. The legend begins with Rhea Silvia, a priestess who bore twin sons to Mars, the god of war. Her uncle, King Amulius, feared these boys might one day challenge his throne. So he ordered them thrown into the flooding Tiber River to drown. But the gods had other plans. The basket carrying the babies washed ashore at the base of the Palatine Hill. There, a she-wolf found them. Instead of devouring the helpless infants, she nursed them as her own cubs. A woodpecker, sacred to Mars, brought them food. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys and raised them with his wife. The twins grew strong and brave. They became leaders among the local shepherds and farmers. When they learned their true identity, they killed the wicked King Amulius and decided to build a city of their own on the spot where the wolf had saved them. But brothers don't always agree. Romulus wanted to build on the Palatine Hill. Remus preferred the Aventine Hill. They decided to let the gods choose by watching for signs in the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but then Romulus saw 12. The argument grew heated. In his anger, Romulus killed his brother and declared himself the sole founder of the new city. He named it Roma, after himself. The date, according to Roman tradition, was April 21st, 753 BC. This story of violence and divine intervention would set the pattern for Roman history. Rome would be a city of warriors, blessed by the gods, but always marked by conflict and ambition. Building the first city. The historical reality was less dramatic, but no less remarkable. Around 753 BC, several small villages on the hills above the Tiber began to come together. These weren't grand settlements, just clusters of simple huts with thatched roofs and walls made of mud and straw. The 7 hills, Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian, each had their own communities. Slowly, these communities began to cooperate. They shared grazing land for their cattle and sheep. They traded pottery and tools. They intermarried. What made this location special wasn't its beauty or its natural defenses. It was position. The 7 hills sat at the first point where the Tiber River could be easily crossed inland from the sea. Trade routes from the north had to pass through here to reach the Greek colonies in southern Italy. The early Romans were farmers and herders, but they were also traders. Salt from the coastal marshes traveled inland along what would become the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Iron and other metals came down from the mountains. Greek pottery and wine arrived from the south. As trade increased, so did the size and importance of Rome. The scattered villages began to merge into a single community. They drained the marshy valley between the hills and created the Forum, a central meeting place for commerce and government. The 7 Kings of Rome. For over 2 centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. Roman historians counted 7 of them, though the early ones were probably more legend than fact. The first king, Romulus, established many of Rome's basic institutions. He divided the people into 3 tribes and created the Senate, a council of elders to advise him. He established the distinction between patricians, the noble families, and plebeians, the common people. Most importantly, Romulus understood that a city needed people. Rome was surrounded by enemies, and its population was small, so he declared Rome a place of sanctuary. Criminals, runaway slaves, and refugees from other cities were welcome. This gave Rome manpower, but it created another problem. There weren't enough women. The Romans solved this with typical directness. They invited the neighboring Sabines to a religious festival, then kidnapped their unmarried daughters. This sparked a war, but eventually the 2 peoples merged, with the Sabine king Titus Tatius ruling alongside Romulus. The later kings were probably real historical figures. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was remembered as a great lawgiver who organized Roman religion and established the calendar. Tullus Hostilius conquered the nearby city of Alba Longa. Ancus Marcius built Rome's first bridge across the Tiber and founded the port city of Ostia at the river's mouth. The last 3 kings were Etruscans, members of the sophisticated civilization that dominated central Italy. Tarquinius Priscus began major construction projects, including the first version of the great sewer system that would make Rome possible. Servius Tullius built the first walls around all 7 hills and organized the Roman army based on wealth rather than birth. Learning from the Etruscans. The Etruscans were Rome's teachers in civilization. While the Romans were still living in simple huts, Etruscan cities boasted stone buildings, elaborate tombs, and advanced metalworking. Etruscan merchants traded across the Mediterranean. Their priests read the future in the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificed animals. Under Etruscan influence, Rome began to look like a real city. The kings drained the Forum and paved it with stone. They built temples on the hills, including the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. They constructed the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, which carried away the city's waste and excess water. The Etruscans also gave Rome many of its political and religious traditions. The fasces, bundles of rods with an axe, symbolizing authority, came from the Etruscans. So did the practice of reading omens before important decisions and the elaborate ceremonies that marked Roman religious life. But the Romans were never just passive students. They adapted what they learned to their own needs and values. Where Etruscan society was dominated by kings and priests, the Romans developed a more military culture. Where the Etruscans focused on trade and luxury, the Romans emphasized discipline and duty. Growing beyond a village. By 600 BC, Rome was no longer a collection of villages. It was becoming a real city, with perhaps 20,000 people living within its walls. The population was a mixture of original Latin settlers, Sabines, Etruscans, and immigrants from across central Italy. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge. It gave Rome a larger population than most of its neighbors and a variety of skills and perspectives. But it also created tensions between different groups, tensions that would shape Roman politics for centuries. The patricians claimed descent from the original Roman families. They owned most of the land and dominated the Senate and the priesthoods. The plebeians included everyone else: farmers, craftsmen, traders, and laborers. Some plebeians were wealthy, but they were excluded from the highest positions in government and religion. Trade continued to expand Rome's influence and wealth. Roman merchants traveled throughout Italy and began to venture across the Mediterranean. Roman pottery and metalwork found markets in distant cities. Foreign goods filled Roman shops and homes. The city's location remained its greatest advantage. All traffic between northern and southern Italy passed through Roman territory. The Romans collected tolls and taxes from this trade, and they used their growing wealth to improve their city and strengthen their army. The end of the kings. The last king of Rome was Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was remembered as a tyrant who ignored the Senate and oppressed the people. Whether this reputation was entirely fair is unclear, but by the late 6th century BC, many Romans had grown tired of royal rule. The final crisis came, according to Roman tradition, in 509 BC. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the wife of a prominent Roman nobleman. Lucretia told her husband what had happened, then killed herself in shame. This act of violence sparked a revolution. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a group of patrician families drove out the royal family and declared that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. They established a new form of government, a republic. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing. Power would no longer belong to one man, but to the Roman people as a whole, at least in theory. In practice, the new republic was controlled by the same patrician families who had dominated the monarchy. But the principle was established. Rome would be governed by its citizens, not by the whims of a single ruler. This decision to reject monarchy would shape everything that followed. For nearly 500 years, Romans would pride themselves on their freedom from kings. Even when the republic eventually collapsed, the emperors who replaced it would carefully avoid the title of king. The year 509 BC marked the end of Rome's childhood. The small city-state that had grown up around the legend of Romulus and Remus was about to become something much larger and more powerful. The Roman Republic was born, and with it began the conquest of Italy, the Mediterranean, and ultimately much of the known world. But first, the Romans had to learn how to govern themselves without a king. This would prove to be almost as challenging as conquering their enemies. Part 2. The Republic Rises, 509–146 BC. Number matter, getting rid of kings, creating the Republic. The Romans of 509 BC faced a problem no civilization had solved before. How do you run a complex society without a king? For thousands of years, cities and nations had been ruled by single leaders: pharaohs in Egypt, kings in Mesopotamia, tyrants in Greece. The idea of governing without one supreme ruler was revolutionary. The Roman solution was born from their deep fear of tyranny. They had lived under Tarquin the Proud, and they never wanted to experience royal oppression again. So they created a system designed to prevent any one person from gaining too much power. Instead of one king, they would have two consuls. These men would serve for only 1 year, and each could veto the decisions of the other. If there was a military crisis, they could appoint a dictator, but only for 6 months, and only for specific purposes. The Senate, which had advised the kings, now became the real power in Rome. Senators served for life and controlled foreign policy, finances, and military commands. They weren't elected by the people, they were chosen by the consuls from among former magistrates, which meant they came almost entirely from patrician families. Below the consuls were other magistrates. Praetors administered justice. quaestors managed finances. Censors counted citizens and oversaw public morality. All of these positions had term limits and shared responsibilities. The Roman people themselves met in assemblies to vote on laws and elect magistrates. But these assemblies were organized in ways that gave more power to the wealthy. The system looked democratic, but it was really an oligarchy, rule by the few. This new republic faced immediate challenges. The exiled King Tarquin tried repeatedly to return, sometimes with foreign armies. Other Latin cities, who had acknowledged Roman leadership under the monarchy, now questioned whether they needed to obey a republic. Most seriously, Rome was surrounded by enemies. To the north were the Etruscans, still powerful despite their declining influence. To the east were the Sabines and other Italian tribes. To the south were the Volsci and Aequi, mountain peoples who regularly raided Roman territory. The early republic survived these threats, but barely. Roman armies were still citizen militias, farmers who put down their plows to pick up swords when needed. They were brave but poorly trained compared to professional soldiers. Yet the republic endured. The Romans learned that their new system, for all its flaws, had one great advantage over monarchy. When a king made a bad decision, the whole kingdom suffered until he died. When Roman leaders made mistakes, they could be replaced quickly. The republic was flexible in a way that monarchies were not. Conquering Italy, one tribe at a time. For the next 250 years, Rome fought almost continuously. Not grand wars of conquest, but a series of smaller conflicts with neighboring peoples. Each war seemed defensive. The Romans were protecting themselves or their allies. But each Roman victory brought new territory, new people, and new enemies. The Romans developed a pattern that would serve them well for centuries. First, they would fight a tribe or city until it submitted. Then, instead of destroying their enemies, they would offer them a deal. Join Rome as allies, keep your own laws and customs, provide soldiers when needed, and in return, Rome would protect you and give you a share in the profits of future conquests. This was revolutionary. Most ancient conquerors either killed their enemies or enslaved them. The Romans turned their enemies into partners. A defeated tribe might find itself fighting alongside Roman soldiers against the next enemy, sharing in victory and plunder. The policy worked brilliantly. Rome's army grew larger with each conquest, not smaller. Defeated enemies became invested in Roman success because they benefited from it. Within a few generations, former enemies saw themselves as Romans. The Romans also understood the importance of roads. As they conquered new territory, they built straight, well-paved roads connecting it to Rome. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was literally true. These roads allowed Roman armies to move quickly to trouble spots, but they also facilitated trade and communication. Roman engineering was practical rather than beautiful. Their roads were built to last, with deep foundations, multiple layers of stone, and careful drainage. Many of these roads remained in use for over 1,000 years. Some are still used today. By 350 BC, Rome controlled most of central Italy. The Roman army was no longer a militia of farmers, but a professional fighting force. Roman soldiers served for years at a time, learning discipline and tactics that made them superior to any other Italian army. The Romans also learned diplomacy. They made alliances with distant peoples, promising protection in exchange for support against mutual enemies. They played their enemies against each other, supporting the weaker side in conflicts to prevent any other power from becoming too strong. In 295 BC, Rome faced its greatest test yet. A coalition of Gauls from the north, Etruscans from the west, and Samnites from the mountains joined together to destroy Roman power. At the Battle of Sentinum, this allied army nearly succeeded, but Roman discipline and the loyalty of Rome's Italian allies won the day. By 264 BC, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River. What had started as a small city-state now ruled a territory larger than Greece. The Roman Confederation included hundreds of cities and tribes, all bound to Rome by treaties that required them to provide soldiers but allowed them to govern themselves. This was Rome's secret weapon, not just its army, but its ability to absorb and integrate other peoples. Rome became stronger with each conquest because it made its enemies into allies. The Punic Wars, meeting Carthage. Rome's expansion in Italy inevitably brought conflict with Carthage, the greatest power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was everything Rome was not, a wealthy trading empire built on commerce rather than conquest, ruled by merchant princes rather than citizen soldiers. The Carthaginians, called Poeni by the Romans, controlled much of North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and parts of Sicily. Their navy dominated the seas. Their merchants traded from Britain to Egypt. Their capital was one of the largest cities in the world. The first conflict came in 264 BC over Sicily. Both Rome and Carthage had interests there, and both were drawn into a local war. This First Punic War lasted 23 years and was fought mainly at sea, a huge challenge for Rome, which had never been a naval power. The Romans solved this problem with typical determination and engineering skill. They built a fleet from scratch, using a captured Carthaginian ship as a model. Since Roman sailors couldn't match Carthaginian seamanship, the Romans invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed them to turn naval battles into land battles. The war was brutal and expensive. Entire fleets were lost in storms. Armies died of disease. Both sides came close to bankruptcy, but Roman manpower and persistence eventually won. In 241 BC, Carthage agreed to give up Sicily and pay a huge indemnity. Sicily became Rome's first province, territory ruled directly by Roman governors rather than through local allies. This marked a new phase in Roman expansion. Rome was becoming an empire, not just a confederation. Hannibal's War. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC and nearly ended Roman history. It started in Spain, where a young Carthaginian general named Hannibal had been building an army and nursing hatred for Rome since childhood. Hannibal's plan was audacious beyond belief. Instead of fighting Rome in Sicily or North Africa, where the Romans expected, he would march overland through Spain, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps to attack Italy itself. The crossing of the Alps was one of history's most famous military achievements. Hannibal's army included 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The Alpine tribes attacked them. Avalanches buried entire units. The cold killed thousands. By the time Hannibal reached Italy, he had lost half his army. But what remained was enough. At the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and finally at Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal destroyed Roman army after Roman army. At Cannae alone, 70,000 Romans died in a single day, the worst defeat in Roman history. Rome's Italian allies began to defect. Syracuse in Sicily joined Carthage. Philip V of Macedon allied with Hannibal. Spain seemed lost. The Roman cause appeared hopeless. But Rome refused to surrender. The Senate declared that no one was even allowed to discuss peace. They adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles while harassing Hannibal's army and recapturing cities that had joined him. The Romans also did what they did best. They turned the war into a contest of resources and alliances. While Hannibal won battles in Italy, Roman armies conquered Carthaginian territory in Spain and threatened Carthage itself in North Africa. The war's turning point came when a young Roman general named Scipio captured New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital in Spain. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned to beat the Carthaginians at their own game. He was the first Roman general who could match Hannibal's brilliance. In 204 BC, Scipio invaded North Africa. Carthage, facing attack at home, recalled Hannibal from Italy. The two greatest generals of their age finally met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio won, ending Hannibal's incredible career and Carthage's hopes of victory. Dracras, masters of the Mediterranean. The Third Punic War was hardly a war at all. By 149 BC, Carthage was no longer a threat to Rome, but influential Romans like Cato the Elder believed that Carthage's very existence was dangerous. Carthage must be destroyed. Cato ended every speech, regardless of the topic. In 146 BC, the Romans besieged Carthage and burned it to the ground. They sold the survivors into slavery and scattered salt over the ruins so nothing would grow there again. The same year, they destroyed Corinth in Greece as a warning to other cities. Rome's enemies learned that resistance was futile. The destruction of Carthage marked Rome's emergence as the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Roman armies had fought in Spain, Gaul, Greece, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Roman fleets controlled the seas. Roman merchants traded from Britain to India. But victory came with a price. The long wars had changed Roman society. Small farmers, who formed the backbone of the early republic, had been ruined by decades of military service. Their land was bought up by wealthy senators who created huge slave-worked estates. The Roman army, once composed of citizen farmers fighting for their homes, increasingly consisted of landless men who served for decades and looked to their generals for rewards. These soldiers were loyal to their commanders rather than to the republic. Wealth poured into Rome from conquered territories, but most of it went to the already rich. The gap between patricians and plebeians widened into a chasm between the wealthy and the desperately poor. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world, but in doing so, it had planted the seeds of its own transformation. The simple republic that had defeated kings and Carthaginians was becoming something else, something that would soon need emperors to hold it together. The Roman Republic had reached its zenith. Soon it would face its greatest enemy, itself. Part 3. Republic Problems. 146 to 44 BC. Getting too big too fast. By 146 BC, Rome controlled an empire that stretched from Spain to Greece, from North Africa to the Alps. It was a stunning achievement, but it came with problems the founders of the Republic could never have imagined. How do you govern territories thousands of miles from Rome? How do you maintain Roman values when Roman soldiers spend decades fighting in foreign lands? How do you keep a republic functioning when it rules over millions of people who aren't Roman citizens? Citizens who owned property had always been required to serve, but now campaigns lasted for years and took place thousands of miles from home. Farmers couldn't abandon their land for such long periods. Gradually, the army filled with landless men who enlisted for decades, hoping to earn enough money to buy farms when they retired. These professional soldiers were loyal to their generals, not to Rome. A successful commander could make his men rich with plunder and land grants. Soldiers began to follow charismatic leaders rather than official orders from the Senate. The brothers who tried to fix everything. The first politicians to seriously address these problems were Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, brothers from one of Rome's most prestigious families. Both served as tribunes of the plebs, officials elected to protect ordinary citizens from aristocratic oppression. Tiberius Gracchus became tribune in 133 BC and immediately proposed land reform. He wanted to break up the huge estates and redistribute land to landless citizens. This would restore the class of small farmers and strengthen the army. It seemed reasonable. The wealthy senators who owned those estates disagreed. They blocked Tiberius's proposal in the Senate and bribed his fellow tribune to veto it. Tiberius responded by taking his law directly to the popular assembly, bypassing the Senate entirely. The conflict escalated rapidly. When Tiberius ran for re-election as tribune, which was probably illegal, a group of senators led by the chief priest attacked him and his supporters with clubs and stones. Tiberius and 300 of his followers were killed. 10 years later, Gaius Gracchus became tribune and tried to continue his brother's work. He proposed not just land reform, but subsidized grain for poor citizens, public works projects to provide jobs, and citizenship for Rome's Latin allies. His program was more radical than his brother's and attracted even fiercer opposition. Gaius died in 121 BC when the Senate authorized the use of force against him. He and 3,000 of his supporters were killed in street fighting. The Gracchi brothers became martyrs to the popular cause, but their deaths showed that the Roman political system could no longer handle serious reform peacefully. Slaves, gladiators, and civil wars. The tensions in Roman society exploded in a series of slave revolts and civil wars. The most famous slave rebellion was led by Spartacus, a gladiator who escaped from a training school in Capua in 73 BC. Spartacus was probably a Thracian warrior who had been captured and forced to fight in the arena for Roman entertainment. He and about 70 other gladiators broke out of their barracks, armed themselves, and fled to Mount Vesuvius. What started as a simple prison break became something much larger. Thousands of slaves joined Spartacus, field hands from the great estates, household servants from Roman villas, miners and craftsmen. His army grew to over 100,000 people. They weren't just fighting for freedom, they were fighting against the entire system that had enslaved them. For 3 years, Spartacus's army defeated Roman legions and ravaged southern Italy. The rebels couldn't win permanently. They had no secure base and faced the full power of the Roman state. But they showed that Rome's empire rested on force, not consent. The rebellion ended when Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, took command of the war against Spartacus. Crassus trapped the rebel army in southern Italy and crucified 6,000 survivors along the road from Capua to Rome as a warning to other potential rebels. Crassus became famous for ending the slave war, but he shared the glory with Pompey the Great, a young general who had been fighting rebels in Spain. Pompey arrived just in time to massacre fleeing slaves and claim credit for the final victory. This partnership between Crassus and Pompey revealed another problem with the Republic. Successful generals were becoming more powerful than the government itself. Both men had armies loyal to them personally. Both had won great victories. Both wanted to be the most important man in Rome. The First Triumvirate. Into this unstable situation came Gaius Julius Caesar, a politician from an old patrician family that had fallen on hard times. Caesar was charming, intelligent, and ruthlessly ambitious. He was also deeply in debt and needed a major military command to restore his fortunes. Caesar realized that he couldn't achieve his goals by working within the traditional system. The Senate was controlled by conservatives who opposed anyone who threatened their privileges, so Caesar made a secret deal with Pompey and Crassus. The 3 most powerful men in Rome would work together to get what they each wanted. This unofficial alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, divided the Roman world among 3 men. Pompey got command in the east and approval for his settlement of conquered territories. Crassus got a profitable command in Syria. Caesar got the consulship for 59 BC and then command of Roman forces in Gaul. The arrangement worked, at least temporarily. Caesar used his consulship to push through laws benefiting his allies and securing his own position. When his term ended, he left for Gaul with 4 legions and a mandate to protect Roman interests against barbarian tribes. Caesar's conquest of Gaul. What Caesar accomplished in Gaul between 58 and 50 BC was extraordinary even by Roman standards. He conquered all of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Britain. He defeated dozens of tribes, captured hundreds of towns, and enslaved over 1 million people. He made himself fantastically wealthy and gave his soldiers more plunder than they had ever dreamed of. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written in the third person like a neutral historical account, described battles and sieges that rivaled anything in Roman history. At Alesia in 52 BC, he besieged the Gallic leader Vercingetorix in a hilltop fortress, then built walls around his own army when a relief force arrived. Caesar won by fighting enemies on 2 sides simultaneously, but Caesar's real achievement wasn't military, it was political. His Gallic campaigns made him the most famous man in Rome. His soldiers were absolutely loyal to him. His wealth allowed him to bribe politicians and provide spectacular entertainments for the Roman people. By 50 BC, Caesar was too powerful for his own good. His command in Gaul was ending, and he was supposed to return to Rome as a private citizen. His enemies in the Senate planned to prosecute him for the illegal acts he had committed as consul. Conviction would mean exile or death. Caesar demanded to be allowed to run for consul again while still commanding his army. This was against the law, but it would protect him from prosecution. The Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, refused. Crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon River marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy. Roman law forbade any general from crossing it with an army. When Caesar reached the river in January 49 BC, he faced the most important decision of his life. He could obey the law, dismiss his army, and return to Rome to face his enemies in court. He would probably be convicted and exiled, ending his political career. Or he could cross the river with his legion and start a civil war that would tear apart the Roman world. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar hesitated at the riverbank, knowing that his decision would change everything. Then he spoke the words that became famous throughout history. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He ordered his army across the Rubicon. Civil war erupted immediately. Most of the Senate fled Rome with Pompey, who still commanded respect as Rome's greatest living general. Caesar's supporters seized the city and the treasury. Italy was divided between those who supported Caesar's populist program and those who feared his ambition. The war lasted 4 years and was fought across the Mediterranean world. Caesar defeated Pompey's forces in Spain, then pursued Pompey himself to Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar's veteran legions destroyed Pompey's larger but less experienced army. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge with King Ptolemy XIII. Instead, the young king had him murdered, thinking this would earn Caesar's gratitude. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's head, he wept. Whether from grief or political calculation, no one could say. The dictator of Rome. Caesar spent the next 2 years eliminating the last resistance to his rule. He defeated Pompey's supporters in Africa and Spain. He pursued his enemies to the ends of the earth and showed mercy only to those who surrendered completely. By 46 BC, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, cowed by his victories, granted him unprecedented powers. He was dictator, consul, and chief priest simultaneously. He controlled all the armies and all the money. He was everything the founders of the Republic had feared. But Caesar was more than a military strongman. He used his power to implement sweeping reforms. He reorganized the calendar, giving us the system we still use today. He extended Roman citizenship to people throughout the empire. He founded new colonies for his veteran soldiers and the urban poor. He began massive construction projects that would employ thousands of workers. Caesar also showed a surprising clemency toward his former enemies. Unlike previous Roman civil wars, which ended in massacres and proscriptions, Caesar pardoned most of his opponents and even appointed some to high positions. He claimed to be healing the wounds of civil war, not deepening them. Yet this mercy may have been Caesar's greatest mistake. Among those he pardoned were men who had never accepted his legitimacy. They saw him not as a reformer, but as a tyrant who had destroyed the Republic. They began to plot his assassination. The Ides of March. The conspiracy against Caesar included over 60 senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus was descended from the founder of the Republic and saw himself as its defender. Cassius was a practical politician who feared Caesar's growing power. The conspirators called themselves liberators. They believed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic and return Rome to its traditional values. They planned to strike on the Ides of March, March 15, 44 BC, when Caesar would address the Senate. Caesar had been warned. Soothsayers told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares about his death. Friends urged him to stay home, but Caesar, who had faced death countless times in battle, refused to show fear before the Senate. When Caesar entered the Senate house, the conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then they struck. Brutus, Cassius, and the others stabbed Caesar 23 times. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding to death in the building where he had once ruled the world. Caesar's last words, according to Shakespeare, were, "Et tu, Brute," and you, Brutus. But the historian Suetonius reported that Caesar said nothing, only pulled his toga over his head to die with dignity. The conspirators expected the Roman people to celebrate Caesar's death as liberation from tyranny. Instead, they found that Caesar was more popular dead than alive. His funeral became a riot. His will left money to every citizen of Rome. The mob burned his body in the Forum and tried to lynch his killers. The liberators had killed Caesar, but they had not saved the Republic. Instead, they had created a power vacuum that would lead to more civil wars and ultimately to the rise of the emperors. The Roman Republic died with Caesar on the Ides of March, even though it would take another 13 years for anyone to admit it. Part 4. The Empire is Born, 44 BC 180 AD. Augustus creates something new. When Julius Caesar died on the Ides of March, Rome faced chaos. The conspirators who killed him had no plan beyond murder. The Senate was paralyzed. 3 different men claimed to be Caesar's rightful successor, and each had armies to back their claims. The first was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and fellow consul. The second was Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's master of cavalry. The third was the biggest surprise of all, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, who had been studying in Greece when the assassination occurred. Most Romans had never heard of Octavius. He was young, sickly, and had no military experience. But Caesar's will named him as adopted son and heir, which meant he inherited not only Caesar's vast wealth, but also his name. Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, though history knows him as Octavian. What Octavian lacked in experience, he made up for in cunning and ruthless determination. He used Caesar's money to recruit an army from Caesar's veterans who were eager to avenge their dead commander. He made temporary alliances with anyone who could help him, then abandoned them when they were no longer useful. The second triumvirate, formed in 43 BC, divided the Roman world among Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. Unlike Caesar's secret partnership with Pompey and Crassus, this was an official arrangement with legal powers. The 3 men called themselves triumvirs and ruled with absolute authority. Their first act was to publish proscription lists, names of enemies who could be killed by anyone, with rewards for their heads. Over 2,000 senators and wealthy citizens died, including the great orator Cicero, who had made the mistake of opposing both Caesar and Antony in his speeches. The triumvirs then pursued Caesar's assassins to Greece and Asia Minor. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were defeated and chose suicide rather than capture. The Roman Republic's last defenders were dead, though few realized the Republic itself had died with them. The final civil war. With Caesar's enemies eliminated, the triumvirs turned on each other. Lepidus was pushed aside early. He kept his life but lost his power. The real struggle was between Octavian, who controlled the West, and Antony, who ruled the East. For 10 years, the 2 men maintained an uneasy peace. They even sealed their alliance with a political marriage. Antony wed Octavian's sister, Octavia. But both men knew that Rome could only have one master. The final break came over Cleopatra, the brilliant and ambitious queen of Egypt. Antony had become her lover and political ally, dreaming perhaps of creating a new empire that blended Roman power with Egyptian wealth and Greek culture. He divorced Octavia and married Cleopatra in an Egyptian ceremony. Octavian used this scandal brilliantly. He portrayed the coming war not as another Roman civil war, but as a struggle between Rome and foreign enemies. Antony wasn't a Roman general anymore. He was Cleopatra's puppet, planning to make Alexandria the capital of the world. The propaganda worked. When war finally came in 32 BC, most Romans supported Octavian. The decisive battle was fought at Actium, off the coast of Greece, in 31 BC. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, but their cause was hopeless. When Octavian invaded Egypt the following year, both committed suicide rather than face capture. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, died from the bite of an asp. Egypt became a Roman province, and Octavian became the sole ruler of the Mediterranean world. The first emperor, who wasn't a king. Octavian faced the same problem that had destroyed Julius Caesar: how to rule an empire while preserving the fiction of republican government. The Romans still hated the idea of kings, but they desperately needed strong leadership after decades of civil war. Octavian's solution was a masterpiece of political theater. In 27 BC, he appeared before the Senate and dramatically resigned all his powers, declaring that he was restoring the Republic. The grateful Senate immediately begged him to reconsider and granted him new titles and authorities. He became Augustus, meaning revered one, a religious title that suggested divine favor without claiming divinity. He was princeps, or first citizen, which sounded democratic while acknowledging his supremacy. He held the power of a tribune, which made his person sacred, and the authority of a consul, which gave him military command. Augustus was careful never to call himself emperor or king. Officially, he was just the most important senator in a restored republic. In reality, he controlled all the armies, appointed all the governors, and made all the important decisions. He had created something entirely new, a monarchy disguised as a republic. The disguise worked because Augustus was a gifted ruler who gave Rome what it desperately needed: peace, prosperity, and stable government. After a century of civil wars, Romans were willing to trade political freedom for security and order. Augustus ruled for 45 years and died peacefully in his bed in 14 AD, something no Roman leader had done since before the Gracchi. On his deathbed, he reportedly asked friends, "Have I played my part well in the comedy of life?" He had indeed. The Roman Empire had begun. The Pax Romana begins. Augustus established what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For over 200 years from his reign until 180 AD, the Roman world enjoyed unprecedented stability and prosperity. This peace wasn't the absence of war. Roman armies continued fighting barbarian tribes along the frontiers. But there were no more civil wars, no more armies marching on Rome, no more proscription lists or political murders. Citizens could travel from Britain to Syria without fear of bandits or warfare. Augustus secured this peace through military reforms that solved the Republic's greatest problem. Instead of citizen militias or armies loyal to individual generals, Augustus created a professional imperial army paid by the state. Soldiers served for 25 years and received land or money when they retired. They swore loyalty to the emperor, not to their commanders. The frontiers were stabilized along natural barriers: the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe, the Sahara Desert in Africa, the Euphrates River in Asia. Augustus built a network of forts, roads, and walls that could hold back barbarian invasions while allowing peaceful trade and cultural exchange. Within the empire, Augustus launched massive construction projects that provided employment and demonstrated Roman power. He boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. New forums, temples, theaters, and basilicas transformed the capital into the most magnificent city in the world. But Augustus's greatest achievement was creating a system that could survive his death. When he died, his stepson Tiberius became emperor smoothly and peacefully. The principle of imperial succession had been established. Rome would be ruled by emperors for the next 500 years. But the golden age of empire. The century and a half after Augustus saw the Roman Empire reach its greatest extent and achieve its highest level of civilization, a series of capable emperors expanded the frontiers, built magnificent monuments, and spread Roman culture throughout the known world. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 AD, was perhaps the greatest of these emperors. A Spanish-born general, he conquered Dacia, modern Romania, adding its gold mines to imperial finances. He briefly conquered Mesopotamia, bringing the empire to its largest size. His column in Rome, decorated with spiraling reliefs of his victories, still stands today. Trajan was also a great builder. His forum in Rome was the largest and most magnificent of all the imperial forums. His baths could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously. His markets, carved into the slope of the Quirinal Hill, were essentially the world's first shopping mall. But the emperor most admired by later generations was Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. Known as the philosopher emperor, Marcus Aurelius wrote Meditations, a series of reflections on Stoic philosophy and the burdens of power. He saw ruling not as a privilege, but as a duty to serve humanity. Marcus Aurelius spent most of his reign fighting barbarian invasions along the Danube frontier. Plague swept through the empire during his reign, killing perhaps a quarter of the population. Yet he held the empire together through personal example and unwavering dedication to duty. Between these great emperors were others who contributed to Roman glory. Hadrian, the traveling emperor, visited every province and built walls, cities, and monuments wherever he went. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, 73 miles long and built entirely of stone, marked the empire's northernmost frontier. Antoninus Pius gave the empire 23 years of peace and prosperity, never leaving Italy during his entire reign. Roman engineering marvels. The golden age of empire was marked by engineering achievements that wouldn't be equaled for over 1,000 years. Roman engineers built roads that lasted centuries, aqueducts that supplied cities with millions of gallons of fresh water daily, and buildings that still inspire awe today. The Roman road system was the internet of the ancient world, a network of communication and transportation that connected every part of the empire. Roman roads were built to military standards, designed to move armies quickly and efficiently, but they also carried merchants, messengers, and ideas. A trader could travel from York in Britain to Antioch in Syria on Roman roads, staying in Roman inns and using Roman currency the entire way. Roman aqueducts were marvels of engineering and mathematics. The aqueduct that supplied the city of Rome brought water from springs 50 miles away, maintaining a precise gradient that allowed gravity to carry the flow. The water crossed valleys on towering stone bridges and passed through mountains in hand-cut tunnels. At its peak, Rome's aqueduct system delivered more water per person than many modern cities. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD, remains the most famous Roman building. This enormous amphitheater could hold 50,000 spectators and featured a complex system of elevators, trapdoors, and movable scenery that allowed elaborate spectacles. The building could even be flooded for mock naval battles. Roman concrete was superior to anything used until the 19th century. Made with volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius, it could set underwater and actually grew stronger over time. The dome of the Pantheon, built during Hadrian's reign, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed. Culture spreads. Across 3 continents. Roman culture during the Golden Age was remarkably cosmopolitan. The empire included people who spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, and followed countless local customs. Yet all were united by Roman law, Roman citizenship, and Roman ideals. Latin became the common language of government, education, and commerce throughout the Western Empire. In the East, Greek served the same function. An educated person anywhere in the empire could communicate with educated people anywhere else. This shared language allowed ideas to spread rapidly across vast distances. Roman law developed into a sophisticated system that influenced legal thinking for centuries. The principle that accused persons were innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, and the notion that laws should be written and public rather than secret. These ideas came from Roman jurisprudence. Roman architecture spread throughout the empire, but it adapted to local conditions and tastes. Roman theaters in Spain looked different from Roman theaters in Turkey, but both followed the same basic principles. Local craftsmen learned Roman techniques and combined them with their own traditions, creating distinctive regional styles. The Romans were remarkably tolerant of local religions and customs, as long as they didn't threaten imperial authority. Celtic Druids were suppressed because they practiced human sacrifice and preached resistance to Rome. But most local gods were simply identified with Roman deities and continued to be worshipped in traditional ways. Trade flourished under the Pax Romana. Roman merchants traded with India for spices and silk, with China for luxury goods, and with Northern Europe for amber and furs. Roman coins have been found as far away as Vietnam and southern India. The empire was connected to trade networks that spanned the known world. Daily life in the capital Rome itself was a city unlike any other in the ancient world. By the 2nd century AD, it housed over 1 million people, a population not equaled by any other city until London in the 19th century. Life in Rome meant living in the greatest, most exciting, and most dangerous city on earth. The wealthy lived in magnificent houses called domus, built around courtyards and decorated with frescoes, mosaics, and gardens. These houses might have dozens of rooms and hundreds of slaves. The richest Romans also owned country estates where they could escape the noise and crowds of the city. But most Romans lived in apartment buildings called insulae that rose 4 or 5 stories high. These buildings were often poorly constructed and overcrowded. The ground floors might house shops and relatively comfortable apartments, but the upper floors were cramped, hot in summer, cold in winter, and always dangerous from fire. Romans of all classes ate differently than we might expect. Breakfast was usually just bread and water. The main meal was dinner, eaten in the afternoon and consisting of multiple courses for the wealthy. Ordinary Romans ate mostly grain, as bread, porridge, or soup, supplemented with olive oil, cheese, vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat. Entertainment was central to Roman life. The emperor provided free grain to prevent hunger and free entertainment to prevent boredom. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal sarcastically called it, kept the urban masses happy and peaceful. Gladiator games were the most famous Roman entertainment. Held in amphitheaters throughout the empire, these contests featured professional fighters battling each other, wild animals, or condemned criminals. Despite Hollywood depictions, most gladiatorial contests weren't fights to the death. Gladiators were expensive to train and maintain. Killing them regularly would have been economically ruinous. Chariot racing was even more popular than gladiator games. The Circus Maximus in Rome could hold 250,000 spectators, a quarter of the city's population. Racing fans supported different teams identified by colors, blues, greens, reds, and whites, with a passion that sometimes erupted into riots. Public baths were perhaps the most characteristic Roman institution. Every neighborhood had its bathhouse, and the wealthy built enormous bathing complexes that served as social centers. Romans would spend hours at the baths, moving from room to room as the temperature increased, scraping off dirt and sweat, exercising, and socializing with friends. Life in the provinces. Life outside Rome varied enormously depending on location, local customs, and degree of Romanization. Some provincial cities, like Alexandria in Egypt or Antioch in Syria, were almost as cosmopolitan as Rome itself. Others remained essentially unchanged from pre-Roman times. Roman citizens throughout the empire enjoyed the same legal rights and protections. They could appeal legal decisions to higher courts, they couldn't be tortured or crucified, and they had the right to trial in Rome for serious crimes. The Apostle Paul famously claimed his right as a Roman citizen when arrested in Jerusalem. But Roman citizenship wasn't universal until 212 AD. Most people in the provinces were either Latin citizens, who had some but not all rights of Roman citizens, or peregrini, foreigners under Roman rule. Social mobility was possible. Slaves could earn or buy their freedom, freedmen could prosper in business, and their children could become full citizens. The Roman army was a major force for Romanization. Soldiers served for 25 years and were often stationed far from their homelands. They married local women, learned local languages, and often settled in their garrison towns when they retired. Veterans' colonies became centers of Roman culture in frontier regions. Roman engineering improved life throughout the provinces. Cities had paved streets, public fountains supplied by aqueducts, sewers, and public buildings. Roman merchants brought goods from across the empire to local markets. Roman roads made travel safer and faster than it had ever been. Yet the empire was built on slavery and exploitation. Conquered peoples paid heavy taxes to support Roman armies and the Roman lifestyle. Rebellions were crushed ruthlessly. The benefits of Roman civilization came at the cost of political freedom and local autonomy. Still, most people in the provinces seemed to accept Roman rule as preferable to the wars and uncertainties that had preceded it. The Pax Romana brought peace, prosperity, and opportunity to millions of people who had never experienced such things before. By 180 AD, the Roman Empire had achieved a level of unity and prosperity that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman literature, and Roman ideals had created a civilization that spanned 3 continents and included people of every race and culture. It seemed as if the Golden Age would last forever. But beneath the surface, problems were already developing that would ultimately transform and divide the empire. The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD is often seen as the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of Rome's long, slow transformation into something entirely different. Part 5. Cracks appear, 180–400 AD. The crisis century begins. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, he broke the pattern that had given Rome almost a century of good government. Instead of choosing the most capable successor, he left the empire to his son Commodus. This single decision would have catastrophic consequences for the Roman world. Commodus was everything his father was not. Where Marcus Aurelius was thoughtful and dutiful, Commodus was impulsive and self-indulgent. He cared nothing for governing and everything for personal pleasure. He spent his time hunting, racing chariots, and fighting as a gladiator in the arena, activities that horrified traditional Romans. The emperor, who saw himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, let others run the empire while he pursued his fantasies. Corruption flourished as court officials sold positions and favors. The army grew restless as discipline declined, and pay fell behind. The Senate watched helplessly as the imperial system that had worked so well began to crumble. In 192 AD, Commodus was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, ending 12 years of misrule. But his death solved nothing. Without a clear successor, the empire plunged into civil war as different armies backed different candidates for emperor. The winner was Septimius Severus, a tough African general who defeated his rivals and established a new dynasty. But Severus's reign marked a fundamental change in the nature of Roman government. He openly declared that the army mattered more than the Senate or the people. His deathbed advice to his sons was simple: enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else. This militarization of the empire had terrible long-term consequences. Emperors now ruled only as long as they could keep the army happy, and keeping the army happy required constant increases in pay and bonuses. The cost of supporting the military began to consume an ever larger share of imperial resources. 50 emperors in 50 years. The crisis reached its worst point in the middle of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire had over 50 emperors. Most ruled for less than 2 years. Most died violent deaths. The imperial system that had provided stability for centuries collapsed into chaos. These weren't palace coups or senatorial conspiracies. These were civil wars fought by professional armies across the length and breadth of the empire. Roman legions that should have been defending the frontiers instead marched against each other in pursuit of imperial power for their commanders. The emperors of this period were mostly soldiers who had risen through the ranks. They understood war but not government, tactics but not strategy. They could win battles but couldn't solve the empire's deeper problems. Many never even visited Rome, ruling instead from military camps on distant frontiers. Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur Fur in 260 AD and spent the rest of his life as a slave. When he died, the Persians skinned his body and displayed it as a trophy. It was the ultimate humiliation for Rome, a Roman emperor dying in foreign captivity. Gallienus, Valerian's son, ruled for 15 years but controlled only part of the empire. In Gaul and Britain, a series of Gallic emperors established an independent state that lasted nearly 20 years. In the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia conquered Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor before declaring independence from Rome. For a time, it seemed the Roman Empire might break apart permanently. 3 separate states claimed to be the true heirs of Rome, each fighting the others while barbarians pressed against all their frontiers. The plague that changed everything. As if civil wars weren't enough, a devastating plague swept through the empire beginning around 249 AD. This epidemic, possibly smallpox or measles, killed an estimated 5,000 people per day in Rome at its peak. The disease spread along the same trade routes that had once brought prosperity to the empire. The plague struck repeatedly over the next 20 years, each outbreak killing thousands more. Entire cities were abandoned. Farmland went uncultivated because there weren't enough people left to work it. The army struggled to maintain its strength as disease killed as many soldiers as enemy weapons. The economic impact was catastrophic. With fewer people to pay taxes and work the land, imperial revenues collapsed. The government responded by debasing the currency, adding less silver and more base metals to coins. This caused massive inflation as merchants raised prices to compensate for the worthless money. By 270 AD, Roman silver coins contained almost no silver at all. Prices increased by 1,000% or more in some regions. People returned to bartering goods directly rather than using Roman currency. The monetary system that had unified the empire for centuries broke down completely. The plague also had profound psychological effects. Many Romans saw the disease as punishment from the gods for abandoning traditional values. Others turned to new religions that promised salvation in an afterlife, since earthly life had become so uncertain and miserable. Christianity, which had been a small sect mainly confined to urban areas, began to grow rapidly during the plague years. Christian communities cared for the sick when others fled, buried the dead when families abandoned them, and offered hope of eternal life to those facing death. Their courage and compassion won many converts. Barbarians at the gates. While the empire tore itself apart with civil wars and plague, barbarian tribes beyond the frontiers were organizing themselves into larger and more dangerous confederations. The peaceful barbarians who had traded with Rome during the Golden Age were being displaced by more warlike peoples moving west from the Asian steppes. The Goths, who had settled north of the Danube, learned Roman military techniques and began raiding deep into imperial territory. In 251 AD, they defeated and killed Emperor Decius in the swamps of Dobruja. It was the first time a Roman emperor had died in battle against barbarians in over 400 years. The Alemanni invaded Italy itself in 268 AD, reaching almost to Rome before being defeated. Other barbarian groups, Franks, Vandals, Saxons, raided throughout Gaul, Britain, and Spain. The Rhine frontier, stable for centuries, became a war zone where Roman and barbarian armies fought constantly. These weren't the unorganized tribal raids of earlier centuries. The barbarians had learned from centuries of contact with Rome. They used Roman weapons and tactics, employed Roman engineers to build siege machines, and sometimes even hired Roman soldiers as mercenaries. Most importantly, entire peoples were on the move. Pushed by population growth and pressure from other tribes, Germanic confederations sought new homes within the empire. They weren't just raiding for plunder, They were migrating with their families, herds, and possessions, looking for land to settle permanently. The Roman military system couldn't handle this new type of threat. The legions were designed to fight organized armies in pitched battles, not to patrol thousands of miles of frontier against mobile raiders. The empire needed more flexible forces, but military reforms required time and money that Rome didn't have. Economic collapse. The combination of civil wars, plague, barbarian invasions, and monetary collapse created a downward spiral that nearly destroyed the empire. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside seeking safety. Trade routes became too dangerous to use regularly. Local regions became isolated and had to become self-sufficient. The tax system broke down as local officials fled or were killed. Soldiers went unpaid and turned to looting the territories they were supposed to protect. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than work for nothing or pay taxes they couldn't afford. Some emperors tried desperate measures to raise money. Caracalla extended Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 AD, but this was mainly a tax measure. Citizens paid higher taxes than non-citizens. The policy raised revenue temporarily, but diluted the meaning of Roman citizenship. Other emperors simply seized private property to fund their armies. Maximinus Thrax confiscated the wealth of temples, private citizens, and entire cities to pay his soldiers. These policies destroyed what remained of civic loyalty and made the empire's financial problems even worse. By 270 AD, the Roman Empire seemed to be in terminal decline. The frontiers were collapsing, the economy was in ruins, and the government had lost the ability to maintain order. Many historians mark this as the beginning of the end for Roman civilization. The restorer of the world. The empire's salvation came from an unexpected source. Aurelian, a tough soldier from the Danube region, who became emperor in 270 AD. In just 5 years, he accomplished what seemed impossible. He reunited the empire and restored Roman power. Aurelian first secured Italy by building new walls around Rome, the first time the capital had needed fortification in over 600 years. Then he systematically reconquered the breakaway regions. He defeated the Gallic Empire and brought Britain, Gaul, and Spain back under Roman control. He destroyed Palmyra and captured Queen Zenobia, marching her through Rome in golden chains. Most importantly, Aurelian stabilized the currency by introducing new gold coins that people trusted. He organized the distribution of free food to Rome's population and restored public order throughout Italy. His contemporaries called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But even Aurelian couldn't solve all the empire's problems. He was assassinated in 275 AD by officers who feared he was becoming too powerful. The empire slipped back into chaos until another strong emperor, Diocletian, seized power in 284 AD. Diocletian realized that the empire was too large and complex for one man to rule effectively. His solution was revolutionary. He divided imperial authority among 4 rulers in what became known as the Tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars, would share power and ensure stable succession. This system worked for about 20 years, providing the stability needed for deeper reforms. Diocletian reorganized the army, the administration, and the tax system. He established maximum prices for goods throughout the empire to control inflation. He persecuted Christians, seeing their religion as a threat to traditional Roman values. But the Tetrarchy broke down after Diocletian retired in 305 AD. Once again, civil war erupted, as different rulers fought for supreme power. The winner of this struggle would change the empire even more dramatically than Diocletian had. Constantine and the Christian Revolution. Constantine became emperor in 312 AD after defeating his rivals in a series of battles culminating at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to Christian sources, Constantine saw a vision of the cross before this battle and heard the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether the vision was real or invented later, Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious toleration throughout the empire. Christians were no longer criminals to be hunted and executed. They could worship openly, build churches, and hold positions in government and the army. This was a stunning reversal. For almost 300 years, Christianity had been illegal, and Christians had faced periodic persecution. Some emperors, like Diocletian, had tried to destroy Christianity completely. Now the emperor himself was supporting the Christian church and may have become a Christian himself. Constantine's conversion, whether genuine or politically motivated, transformed both the empire and Christianity. The church went from being a persecuted minority to being the emperor's favored religion. Christian bishops became important political figures. Church councils were held under imperial authority to settle theological disputes. The emperor also built a new capital city on the site of ancient Byzantium, at the strategic point where Europe and Asia meet. Constantinople, as it was called, was designed to be a new Rome, a Christian capital for a Christian empire. The city was dedicated in 330 AD with elaborate ceremonies that blended Christian and Roman traditions. Constantinople was strategically located to control trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and between Europe and Asia. It was also closer to the dangerous Danube frontier and the Persian border than Rome was. From a military and economic standpoint, the new capital made perfect sense. But the founding of Constantinople also represented a fundamental shift in the empire's center of gravity. Rome had been the heart of the empire for over 800 years. Now power was moving eastward, to a Greek-speaking city in a predominantly Christian region. The old gods fade away. Constantine's successors, with one notable exception, continued his pro-Christian policies. The Emperor Julian, known to Christians as the Apostate, tried briefly to restore the old Roman gods between 361 and 363 AD. But his reign lasted only 2 years, and his death while fighting the Persians ended the last serious attempt to reverse the Christianization of the empire. The transformation of Roman religion happened surprisingly quickly. In 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Pagan temples were closed or converted into churches. Traditional festivals were banned or transformed into Christian celebrations. The Olympic Games, held for over 1,000 years, were abolished as a pagan ritual. This religious revolution changed Roman culture profoundly. Classical literature and philosophy, which had been based on pagan mythology and values, fell out of favor. Christian writers like Augustus created new forms of literature and thought. Latin, the language of Roman law and administration, became the language of Christian theology. The change wasn't always peaceful. Christian mobs sometimes attacked pagan temples and destroyed classical artworks. In 391 AD, the Great Library of Alexandria was severely damaged by Christian rioters. Scholars and philosophers who clung to the old ways were persecuted or forced into exile. Yet Christianity also preserved much of classical culture. Christian monasteries copied and preserved ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost. Christian scholars studied Greek philosophy and Roman law, adapting them to Christian purposes. The synthesis of classical and Christian culture created a new civilization that would dominate Europe for centuries. East and West divide. The most fateful of Constantine's decisions was probably his creation of Constantinople as a second imperial capital. This division of the empire between East and West, intended as an administrative convenience, gradually became a permanent split. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, was wealthier and more populated than the West. It controlled the profitable trade routes to Asia and had more defensible frontiers. Greek was the dominant language, and the population was becoming increasingly Christian. The Western Empire, still centered on Rome, faced more barbarian pressure and had fewer resources to resist it. Latin remained the official language, but Germanic languages were spreading in the frontier regions. The population was more mixed, including many barbarian settlers who had been allowed to live within the empire. By 400 AD, the two halves of the empire were developing different cultures, different priorities, and different solutions to their problems. The East emphasized diplomacy and often paid barbarian tribes to attack the West instead of Eastern territories. The West relied increasingly on barbarian mercenaries to defend itself against other barbarians. Communication between East and West became more difficult as the frontiers became less secure. Emperors in Constantinople might not learn of events in Gaul or Britain for months. Western emperors had little influence over Eastern policies and vice versa. The empire was still nominally united under a single law code and shared Christian faith, but in practice, it was becoming two separate civilizations that happened to share a common Roman heritage. This division would have enormous consequences for the final collapse of Roman power in Western Europe. By 400 AD, the Roman Empire was a very different place from what it had been during the Golden Age. It was officially Christian rather than pagan, administratively divided rather than unified, and economically struggling rather than prosperous. The barbarian problem had grown from occasional raids to constant pressure along all frontiers. Yet the empire survived. The eastern half would last for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. Even the western half had almost a century of life left, and Roman culture and law would influence European development long after the last emperor fell. The crisis of the 3rd and 4th centuries had not destroyed Rome. It had transformed it into something entirely different. The classical world of Caesar and Augustus was ending, but a new Christian civilization was being born from its ruins. Part 6. The Fall, 400–476 AD. The Great Migration begins. By 400 AD, the Roman Empire faced a crisis unlike any in its history. Beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers, entire peoples were on the move. These weren't the small raiding parties of earlier centuries, but massive migrations involving hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children seeking new homes within the empire. The catalyst for this great migration was the arrival of the Huns, a nomadic people from the Asian steppes. Under their leader Attila, the Huns swept westward, displacing Germanic tribes that had lived beyond Roman frontiers for centuries. Faced with conquest by the Huns or migration into Roman territory, most Germanic peoples chose migration. The Visigoths were among the first to seek refuge within the empire. In 376 AD, they petitioned Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube and settle in Thrace. Valens agreed, seeing an opportunity to gain new soldiers and taxpayers. But Roman officials treated the Gothic refugees harshly, selling them dog meat at inflated prices and enslaving their children. The mistreated Goths soon rebelled. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, they destroyed a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. For the first time in centuries, a barbarian army had defeated Roman legions in a major battle and killed a reigning emperor. Theodosius III eventually made peace with the Visigoths, allowing them to settle in the Balkans as foederati, allied troops who served Rome in exchange for land and subsidies. This policy seemed to solve the immediate crisis, but it set a dangerous precedent. Rome was now paying barbarian tribes to defend Roman territory against other barbarians. The sack of Rome. The Visigoths remained restless under their ambitious king Alaric. When Rome failed to provide promised subsidies and positions, Alaric led his people into Italy. For 2 years, the Visigoths ravaged the Italian countryside while the Western Roman Emperor Honorius cowered behind the walls of Ravenna, his heavily fortified capital. In 410 AD, Alaric's Visigoths achieved what no foreign enemy had accomplished in over 800 years. They captured and sacked Rome itself. For 3 days, Gothic warriors looted the former capital of the world, carrying away treasures that had been accumulating for centuries. The psychological impact of Rome's fall was enormous. Throughout the empire, people struggled to understand how the eternal city could have fallen to barbarians. Some Christians saw it as divine punishment for Rome's pagan past. Others blamed Christianity for weakening traditional Roman military virtues. St. Augustine wrote, "The city of God, partly in response to the sack of Rome, arguing that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but the kingdom of God is eternal. His work helped Christians understand that Rome's fall didn't mean the end of the world, just the end of one particular civilization. But the Visigoths weren't interested in destroying Roman civilization, they wanted to join it. After sacking Rome, they moved into southern Gaul and Spain, where they established kingdoms that preserved Roman law and administration while adapting to Germanic customs. Vandals and the sea. While the Visigoths settled in Gaul and Spain, other Germanic tribes carved out their own territories within the crumbling Western Empire. The Vandals, led by their king Gaiseric, crossed from Spain into North Africa in 429 AD. The Vandals quickly conquered Rome's richest provinces, including the vital grain-producing regions of Tunisia and Algeria. They captured Carthage in 439 AD and built a powerful fleet that dominated the western Mediterranean. For the first time since the Punic Wars, Rome's control of the seas was challenged. In 455 AD, the Vandals sailed from Carthage to Rome and sacked the city again, this time more thoroughly than the Visigoths had. They stripped Rome of its remaining treasures and carried thousands of Romans into slavery, including members of the imperial family. The Vandal conquest of North Africa was particularly devastating because it cut off Rome's grain supply. The Western Empire had depended on African grain for centuries. Without it, Italy faced chronic food shortages, and the imperial government lost a major source of tax revenue. The Vandals also persecuted Orthodox Christians, favoring instead the Arian form of Christianity that most Germanic tribes had adopted. This religious conflict added another layer of complexity to the already chaotic situation in the former Roman territories. The Huns, under Attila. The most feared of all barbarian leaders was Attila, king of the Huns. Known to Romans as the Scourge of God, Attila controlled a vast confederation of tribes stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. His mounted warriors struck terror throughout Europe. Attila was more than a barbarian warlord. He was a shrewd diplomat who played the Eastern and Western empires against each other. He demanded enormous tributes from Constantinople while threatening to ally with the Persians. He negotiated with Western Roman generals while planning invasions of Gaul and Italy. In 451 AD, Attila invaded Gaul with an enormous army estimated at 500,000 warriors from dozens of different tribes. The Western Romans, led by the general Aetius, formed an unlikely alliance with their Visigothic enemies to face this greater threat. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was one of the largest battles in ancient history. Romans, Visigoths, and other Germanic tribes fought side by side against Attila's Hun confederation. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but Attila withdrew from Gaul, never to return. The following year, Attila invaded Italy and advanced toward Rome. Pope Leo III met the Hun king outside the city and somehow persuaded him to withdraw. Whether through diplomacy, bribery, or divine intervention, Rome was spared another sack. Attila's death in 453 AD ended the Hun threat, but it also removed the external pressure that had held some Germanic tribes together. The Hun Confederation collapsed, and its former subjects scattered throughout Europe, adding to the chaos in the former Roman territories. 1. Romans who weren't Roman. By 450 AD, the Roman army was Roman in name only. Most soldiers were barbarians, Germanic warriors who fought under Roman banners in exchange for pay and the chance to settle within the empire. Many officers were also barbarians, who had risen through the ranks or been appointed by treaties with their tribes. This transformation of the army reflected a broader change in Roman society. Throughout the Western Empire, Germanic peoples had been settling for decades. Some came as invaders, others as invited settlers, still others as individual immigrants seeking opportunities. These barbarians didn't necessarily want to destroy Roman civilization. Many admired Roman law, Roman cities, and Roman culture, but they brought their own languages, customs, and values, gradually transforming the territories where they settled. The process was often peaceful. A Germanic nobleman might marry into a Roman senatorial family, combining barbarian military prowess with Roman administrative skills. Their children would be culturally mixed, equally comfortable in both Germanic and Roman traditions. Even the imperial court employed barbarian generals and advisors. Stilicho, the most powerful man in the Western Empire during the early 5th century, was half Vandal. Ricimer, who controlled the empire in the 460s, was half Suevian. These men saw themselves as defenders of Rome, even though their enemies accused them of being barbarian puppets. The distinction between Roman and barbarian became increasingly meaningless. What mattered was loyalty to the emperor and acceptance of Roman law and customs, not ethnic origin or place of birth. Managing the impossible, Roman administrators tried various strategies to manage the barbarian settlements. The foederati system gave entire tribes land and subsidies in exchange for military service. This worked when the tribes remained loyal, but it failed when they decided their interests lay elsewhere. Some emperors tried to play barbarian groups against each other. They would encourage one tribe to attack another, hoping to keep all of them too weak to threaten Roman authority. This strategy sometimes worked temporarily but created a constant state of low-level warfare. Direct annexation was another option, simply declaring barbarian territories to be Roman provinces and appointing Roman governors. But the empire lacked the military strength to enforce such claims against determined resistance. The most successful approach was often negotiation and accommodation. Roman officials would recognize a barbarian king as an official ally of Rome, grant him Roman titles and honors, and allow him to govern his people according to their own customs while maintaining nominal Roman sovereignty. These arrangements satisfied everyone's pride and often worked for a generation or more. But they gradually eroded the reality of Roman control. Local strongmen, whether ethnically Roman or barbarian, became more important than distant imperial officials. The last Western emperors. The final century of the Western Roman Empire saw a parade of weak emperors, many of them children controlled by barbarian generals or powerful court officials. Real authority lay with military commanders who appointed and deposed emperors at will. Majorian, who ruled from 457 to 461 AD, was perhaps the last effective Western emperor. He attempted to rebuild Roman military power and reconquer the barbarian kingdoms. He defeated the Visigoths in battle and nearly recaptured North Africa from the Vandals. But Majorian's efforts came too late. He was assassinated by Ricimer, the barbarian general who controlled the Western court. Ricimer preferred weak emperors who wouldn't interfere with his own power and policies. The emperors who followed were mostly figureheads. They held elaborate ceremonies, issued official documents, and maintained the fiction of Roman government. But they controlled little territory beyond Italy, and even there their authority was limited. Many of these later emperors had Germanic names and backgrounds. Glycerius, Olybrius, and others represented the complete fusion of Roman and barbarian elites that had been developing for decades. Dri, 476 A.D., the end of an empire. The last Western Roman emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. The irony of his name wasn't lost on contemporary observers. The first Roman emperor had been Augustus. The last bore his name in diminutive form. The legendary founder of Rome had been Romulus. The empire's final ruler shared that name as well. Romulus Augustulus was controlled by his father Orestes, a Roman general who had served under Attila the Hun. In 476 AD, Orestes refused demands from Germanic soldiers for land grants in Italy. The soldiers rebelled under their leader Odoacer, a chieftain of mixed Germanic ancestry. Odoacer defeated Orestes and captured Ravenna, but instead of killing young Romulus Augustulus, he pensioned him off to a comfortable retirement. There was no dramatic last stand, no heroic final battle. The Western Roman Empire simply ended with an administrative decision. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the crown, scepter, and other symbols of Roman authority, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. He declared that the West no longer needed its own emperor and asked to be recognized as King of Italy under overall Roman sovereignty. This polite fiction satisfied everyone's dignity. Zeno could claim that the Roman Empire was reunited under his authority. Odoacer could rule Italy without appearing to be a usurper. The Roman Senate could continue to function under barbarian protection. But everyone understood the reality. Roman rule in the West was over. Italy, like Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, was now ruled by a Germanic king. What fall really means. The traditional date for the fall of the Roman Empire is 476 AD, when Romulus Augustus was deposed. But this date is somewhat arbitrary. The empire had been disintegrating for decades, and its fall was more of a gradual transformation than a sudden collapse. In many ways, Roman civilization continued under barbarian rule. The Ostrogothic kings who succeeded Odoacer in Italy maintained Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture. They saw themselves as successors to the Roman emperors, not as conquerors. The Catholic Church preserved much of Roman learning and organization. Latin remained the language of government, education, and religion throughout Western Europe. Roman law continued to influence legal systems for centuries. Many Roman institutions survived in modified form. The Senate continued to meet in Rome until the 6th century. Roman titles and honors were still sought by barbarian nobles. Roman engineering techniques were used to maintain aqueducts, roads, and buildings. What really ended in 476 AD was not Roman civilization, but the Western Roman political system. The idea that all of Western Europe should be governed by a single emperor from a single capital. This unity was never fully restored, despite attempts by Charlemagne, Napoleon, and others. The Eastern Empire endures. While the Western Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire survived and even flourished. Centered in Constantinople, it controlled the Balkans, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, some of the richest and most populous regions of the old empire. The Eastern Empire, which historians call the Byzantine Empire, would last for another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 AD. At its peak under Justinian in the 6th century, it even reconquered much of Italy, North Africa, and Spain. The Byzantines considered themselves Romans and maintained many Roman traditions. Their official language was Greek rather than Latin, and their culture was increasingly influenced by Christianity and Eastern traditions. But they preserved Roman law, Roman administrative practices, and the Roman imperial idea. The survival of the Eastern Empire shows that Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. Given sufficient resources, effective leadership, and defensible frontiers, Roman institutions could adapt and endure. The West fell because it faced more severe challenges with fewer resources to meet them. Transformation, not destruction. Modern historians increasingly view the fall of Rome as a transformation rather than a collapse. The Roman Empire didn't suddenly disappear in 476 AD. Instead, it evolved into something different, a collection of Germanic kingdoms that preserved many Roman features while adapting to new circumstances. This transformation was traumatic and often violent. Cities shrank, trade declined, and learning was preserved mainly in monasteries. The population of Western Europe probably fell significantly as warfare and disease took their toll. But the change also brought new energy and ideas to a civilization that had become rigid and conservative. Germanic law codes, Celtic artistic traditions, and Christian theology combined with Roman administrative practices to create the foundations of medieval European civilization. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule weren't backward or primitive. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain all developed sophisticated governments, rich cultures, and extensive trade networks. These kingdoms saw themselves as heirs to Rome, not as its destroyers. They preserved what they valued from Roman civilization while discarding what no longer seemed useful. In doing so, they created something new, that would eventually become the medieval world. The Roman Empire in the West ended not with a bang, but with a gradual fade into something different. The imperial purple was laid aside, but Roman influence continued to shape European development for centuries to come. In that sense, Rome never really fell. It simply changed into the many nations and cultures that would inherit its legacy. Part 7. Legacy: What Rome Left Behind. As we reach the end of our journey through Roman history, we can ask ourselves, what remains of this great empire that once ruled the world? The answer is everywhere around us. Rome didn't disappear when the last emperor stepped down. It simply changed form, spreading its influence into every corner of the modern world. Laws and government ideas still used today. Perhaps Rome's greatest gift to humanity was the idea of written law that applies to everyone equally. Before Rome, most societies were ruled by the personal whims of kings or the unwritten customs of tribes. The Romans created something entirely new, laws that were written down, made public, and applied consistently to all citizens. The principle that people are innocent until proven guilty comes from Roman law. The right to a fair trial, to present evidence, to have legal representation, these are all Roman concepts. When you sign a contract today, you're using legal principles that Roman lawyers developed over 2,000 years ago. Modern legal systems throughout Europe, Latin America, and much of the world are based directly on Roman law. The Code of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century, preserved Roman legal thinking and became the foundation for most Western legal traditions. The word republic itself is Roman, res publica, meaning the public thing. The idea that government belongs to the people rather than to a king, that power should be divided to prevent tyranny, that officials should serve limited terms, these concepts come from the Roman Republic. The American Constitution borrowed heavily from Roman ideas. The Senate takes its name directly from the Roman institution. The system of checks and balances reflects Roman attempts to prevent any one person from becoming too powerful. When modern democracies limit executive authority, they're following principles the Romans established. Even the buildings where modern governments meet echo Roman designs. Domed Capitol buildings recall the Pantheon. Legislative chambers with semicircular seating arrange representatives the way Roman senators once sat. The physical spaces of democracy are Roman in origin. Latin becoming Spanish, French, Italian Latin may be considered a dead language, but it lives on in the mouths of hundreds of millions of people every single day. Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian are all direct descendants of the Latin that Roman soldiers, merchants, and settlers spoke throughout the empire. These Romance languages preserve not just Roman words, but Roman ways of thinking about the world. When a Spanish speaker says ciudad, a French speaker says cité, or an Italian speaker says città, they're all using the Roman word civitas, carrying with it the Roman understanding of urban civilization. But Latin's influence extends far beyond the Romance languages. English, despite being a Germanic language, contains thousands of Latin words. Almost every word ending in -ian comes from Latin: civilization, nation, education, administration. Legal terms, medical terminology, and scientific names are all in Latin. When you use words like justice, liberty, republic, constitution, federal, or senate, you're speaking Latin. When you talk about animal, human, divine, or mortal, you're using Roman concepts. Latin shapes how we think, even when we don't realize it. The Roman alphabet you're reading right now, these letters were developed by Roman scribes and spread throughout the empire. Today, more than a third of the world's population uses the Roman alphabet in their writing systems. Architecture. We still copy. Walk through any major city in the world, and you'll see Roman architecture everywhere. Government buildings feature Roman columns and domes. Museums and universities use Roman pediments and porticos. Sports stadiums echo the design of the Colosseum. The dome, perfected by Roman engineers in buildings like the Pantheon, tops capitol buildings on every continent. The arch, which Romans used in bridges, aqueducts, and buildings, remains one of the strongest structural forms ever devised. Modern engineers study Roman concrete to understand how Roman structures have lasted over 2,000 years while more recent buildings crumble. Roman architectural innovations made possible the large public buildings that define modern cities. The principles of load distribution, proper foundation, effective drainage, these came from Roman engineering. When modern architects design bridges, they're using principles the Romans established. The Pantheon in Rome, built nearly 2,000 years ago, still has the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. It inspired the design of the U.S. Capitol, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and countless other government and religious buildings worldwide. Even modern apartment buildings owe something to Roman insulae, multi-story residential structures that housed urban populations efficiently. The challenge of providing housing for large numbers of people in cities is fundamentally Roman, and our solutions still reflect their innovations. Roads and cities, still in use. All roads lead to Rome was once literally true. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads throughout their empire, creating history's most extensive transportation network before the modern era. Many of these roads are still in use today. The Via Appia, built in 312 BC, still carries traffic after more than 2,300 years. Parts of Watling Street in England became the modern A5 highway. The Via Augusta in Spain forms the basis of modern Spanish highways. Throughout Europe, major roads follow routes first laid down by Roman engineers. Roman road-building techniques were so advanced that they weren't significantly improved until the 18th century. The Romans understood the importance of deep foundations, proper drainage, multiple layers of materials, and straight routes. Modern highway engineering follows many of the same principles. But more important than the physical roads was what they represented, the idea that distant places could be connected for trade, communication, and travel. Roman roads created the first global economy, allowing goods and ideas to flow freely across vast distances. Modern transportation networks serve the same function. Many major cities began as Roman settlements. London started as Londinium. Paris grew from Lutetia. Vienna began as Vindobona. Cologne, Milan, Barcelona, Lyon, and dozens of other European cities trace their origins to Roman founding. These cities preserve their Roman origins in their layouts, their central squares that were once Roman forums, and their locations chosen by Roman engineers for strategic and economic advantages. The grid pattern of many city streets reflects Roman urban planning. Roman aqueducts still supply water to Rome itself. Some have been in continuous operation for 2,000 years. Roman sewers still drain cities throughout Europe. Roman harbors still serve as ports. The physical infrastructure of Roman civilization remains functional today. Rome never really died, just changed. As we've seen throughout this long journey, the fall of Rome wasn't really a fall at all. It was a transformation, a gradual change from one form of civilization to another. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476 AD, but Roman culture, law, language, and ideas continued to shape the world. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the West saw themselves as heirs to Rome, not as its destroyers. They preserved Roman law, used Latin in their courts and churches, maintained Roman cities and roads, and adopted Roman titles and administrative practices. The Catholic Church became, in many ways, the continuation of Roman civilization. It preserved Latin as a living language. It maintained Roman administrative structures. It kept alive Roman learning and literature through the preservation of manuscripts in monasteries. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, continued for another 1,000 years after the West fell. Constantinople remained the greatest city in Christendom until it fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Even then, the Ottoman sultans claimed to be the rightful successors of Rome. The Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800 AD, explicitly claimed to be the revival of Roman imperial authority, though it was, as Voltaire quipped, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It showed how the idea of Rome continued to inspire European rulers for centuries. Napoleon crowned himself emperor and adopted Roman symbols like the eagle and the laurel wreath. Mussolini tried to recreate the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. Hitler called his regime the Third Reich, the Third Roman Empire. Even in the 20th century, Rome remained a powerful symbol. But Rome's real survival wasn't in these attempts to recreate its empire. It was in the lasting influence of its ideas, institutions, and innovations. Every time someone signs a legal contract, speaks a Romance language, votes in an election, or walks on a paved road, they're experiencing Rome's continuing presence in the world. Its ideas live on in the modern world. The concept of citizenship, the idea that people have both rights and responsibilities in relation to their government, is fundamentally Roman. The principle of equality before the law, however imperfectly realized, comes from Rome. The notion that government should serve the common good rather than the ruler's personal interests is Roman. Rome gave the world the idea that different peoples could live together peacefully under common laws and institutions. The Roman Empire at its height included people of every race, religion, and culture, all united by Roman citizenship and Roman law. This multicultural vision, though it eventually failed, planted seeds that continue to grow today. The modern world's international organizations, the United Nations, the European Union, international courts and treaties, all reflect the Roman attempt to create order and justice across national boundaries. When nations agree to follow common rules and submit disputes to arbitration, they're following a Roman model. Roman engineering principles guide modern construction. Roman agricultural techniques influence modern farming. Roman military organization provided the model for modern professional armies. Roman business practices laid the foundation for modern commerce and banking. Even our calendar is essentially Roman. Julius Caesar reformed the calendar in 46 BC, creating the system we still use. The months bear Roman names: January for Janus, March for Mars, July for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus. Pope Gregory the Mouthern's minor adjustments in 1582 created the Gregorian calendar that most of the world uses today. Our week of 7 days comes from the Romans. Our dating system, counting years from the birth of Christ, was created in the Christian Roman Empire. Our hourly division of the day into 24 hours traces back to Roman timekeeping. Rome structured how we organize time itself. The Renaissance, the great flowering of art and learning that began in Italy in the 14th century, was fundamentally an attempt to recover and revive classical Roman culture. The Enlightenment thinkers who shaped modern democracy studied Roman history and law. The founders of the American Republic consciously modeled their new nation on Roman examples. In literature, law, philosophy, engineering, government, language, and countless other fields, Rome's influence remains profound. The modern world is built on Roman foundations, whether we recognize it or not. A peaceful ending. And so we come to the end of our long journey through Roman history. From the legendary founding by Romulus and Remus, through the struggles of the Republic, the glory of the Empire, and the transformation that people call the Fall, we've witnessed over 200 years of human history. We've seen Rome grow from a small collection of villages on 7 hills to an empire that ruled the known world. We've watched great leaders rise and fall: Caesar and Augustus, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, Constantine and Justinian. We've witnessed the spread of Roman civilization across 3 continents, the building of roads and cities that still stand today, the creation of laws and institutions that continue to govern human societies. But more than anything, we've seen the remarkable resilience of Roman ideas and innovations. The empire may have fallen, but Roman civilization never died. It transformed, adapted, and spread throughout the world, becoming part of the heritage of all humanity. As you drift towards sleep, you can take comfort in knowing that you're part of this continuing story. The world you live in was shaped by Rome, the language you speak, the laws that protect you, the roads you travel, the buildings around you, all carry traces of Roman influence. Rest peacefully tonight, knowing that civilizations rise and fall, but the best of human achievement endures. Rome built for eternity, and in many ways it succeeded. Its legacy lives on in you, in the modern world, in the continuing human quest to create justice, beauty, and meaning. Sleep well. Dream of ancient Rome if you wish, or simply drift into peaceful darkness. The story is complete. The journey is ended. All is well. Good night.